is the Red Sea miracle. What sea was really parted? And could there still be evidence? The traditional understanding was that the north end of Suez was where the miracle at the sea took place.
Imagine ancient tales of miracles, parting seas, wandering deserts, meeting the rigor of modern science. For centuries, skeptical scholars dismissed these Bible stories as fanciful folklore. Yet our boldest archaeologists and oceanographers refused to give up, trekking to remote shores and crunching mountains of data for a glimpse of truth.
I said, is there any evidence of the Israelites?
Now, at long last, they've uncovered tantalizing clues that could confirm the legendary Red Sea crossing wasn't just a bedtime story. Curious how wind patterns and underwater ridges line up with scripture? You won't believe what they discovered, and neither will your most doubtful friends. Stick around to the very end to see the breakthrough for yourself. The road through the sea. Israel isn't just a footnote in a dusty old book. It's the lifeblood running through countless stories in the Bible.
Sea crossing far from Egypt, at the Red Sea's Gulf of Aqaba. This is because they emphasize the entire narrative of the Bible.
From its earliest moments as a handful of families to its standing today as a modern nation, Israel sits at the center of some of the most astonishing tales ever told. It all begins with a man named Abraham, whose family grew into 12 tribes under Jacob, also called Israel. Over time, those tribes settled in Egypt, where they started as honored guests, but soon became enslaved. By the time Moses steps into the picture, the Israelites have known nothing but forced labor. Sunrise to sunset brickmaking and city building, all for Pharaoh's glory. Families were torn apart, newborns faced danger, and daily life offered little hope.
The Bible says that a family of people called the Israelites spent centuries living in Egypt.
That's where the book of Exodus, literally departure in Greek, kicks off. This isn't a travel guide. It's an origin story about what happens when an entire people decides freedom is worth any price. The Bible paints Egypt's rulers as bad-tempered tyrants. Pharaoh redefines harsh with bloodied rivers, clouds of locusts, and the shattering grief of losing firstborn sons. Each plague is like a cosmic warning. Let these people go. Finally, Moses leads the Israelites out in the dead of night. They carry what they can and follow a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, symbols of a promise guiding them toward a land they've never seen. But freedom doesn't come without its critics. At dawn, Pharaoh regrets his decision and dispatches his chariots in hot pursuit.
Death to the slaves! Death to their God!
When the Israelites reach the Sea of Reeds, what most of us call the Red Sea, they're stuck. Behind them, an army thunders. Ahead, water stretches as far as the eye can see.
No, it comes from the desert. That's the thunder of horses. Look! Pharaoh's chariot!
Then comes the moment that changes everything. Moses lifts his staff, and the water pulls back, forming two towering walls. A dry path appears, wide enough for roughly 2 million people. Imagine the scene. A hush falls as the first families step forward. Children clutch their mothers' hands. Soldiers in hot pursuit skid into the gap, wheels skittering on dry ground. Behind the last Israelite is the echo of a final drum. The waters slam shut, sweeping away those who chased freedom with a sword. For generations, believers have seen this as proof that faith can move mountains or part seas. Skeptics have looked for wind-driven surges, shallow marshes that could drain under extreme conditions, or rare tidal shifts. Today, scientists scan ancient shorelines with satellites and sonar, hunting for chariot wheels or human remains buried in the seabed's silt. A few odd metal circles or strangely shaped mounds could tip the scale from myth to history.
Is the Red Sea miracle? What sea was really parted? And could there still be evidence?
But whether you see it through the lens of faith or science, the Red Sea crossing resonates because it's more than a miracle story.
The traditional understanding was that the north end of Suez was where the miracle at the sea took place.
It's about daring to believe that the impossible might just be waiting for a moment of courage. It's about a people who'd spent lifetimes under someone else's heel, choosing to risk everything for a shot at a better life. The Red Sea Riddle. If you'd been one of those Israelites, how could you even begin to describe what happened without sounding completely crazy? You'd have to tell people that an immense sea seemed to take on a life of its own, stretching itself into two colossal walls and revealing a solid path for nearly 2 million souls to cross. And that's just the first oddity. Even more unbelievable, the waters somehow knew when every one of the good guys had made it across. At the exact moment the last Israelite stepped onto dry land, the sea snapped back together like a trapdoor shutting, swallowing Pharaoh's army and leaving 0 survivors.
Thou didst blow with thy wind, and the sea covered them. Who is like unto thee, O Lord?
How do you share a story like that and still expect anyone to believe you? Not surprisingly, even after centuries of hearing the tale about Israel's epic escape from Egypt, we're not all on the same page about what really happened at the Red Sea. Instead, that moment, where the Sea of Reeds transforms into a dry highway, has sparked more questions than answers. Was it a genuine miracle? Or did something else, something we can explain with wind, tides, and ancient geography, make it look that way?
The Bible says that the countries around them had heard about their deliverance through the sea.
Now, let's start with the nuts and bolts of our world. Gravity is a stubborn force. It doesn't pause because we need a path to freedom. Every drop of water wants to fall back down, filling any gap it once left. The idea that an ocean could push itself aside, hold its shape as 2 walls, and stay that way long enough for 2 million people and their animals to stroll through, well, that goes against everything we know about nature. To prop up walls over 100 feet tall, you'd need a force anywhere near what holds skyscrapers upright. Yet there's no natural law that suddenly turns water into stone. Sure, folks point to tidal surges or tsunamis. We've seen in recent times how a tsunami can sweep miles inland, or how strong winds can push water away from a coastline for a few moments. But those are violent, unpredictable, and very brief. They don't create a calm, walkable corridor. A tsunami leaves debris and destruction. It doesn't neatly part like the pages of a book. And a wind-driven trough might lower water levels by a few feet, not enough to clear the path for an entire mass of people and livestock. That's where the supernatural explanation steps in for believers. Maybe God did it, plain and simple. But scientists can't put divine intervention under a microscope or run it through a lab test. Science relies on repeated experiments and solid data, things you can see, touch, and measure. Without a way to test for a miracle, it stays outside the realm of empirical study. So researchers look for clues that fit with what we know, geology, weather patterns, and ancient records, in hopes of finding a middle ground between myth and reality. Then there's Pharaoh. The Bible makes it sound like he went down with his army, swallowed by the returning waters. But some historians say, not so fast. Inscriptions and tomb records hint that the ruling king didn't vanish that day. His name surfaces in documents dated years after the Exodus would have occurred. If he really had drowned, you'd expect the end of his line. And yet, Egyptian history marches on. Some scholars suggest his body might have been retrieved, or maybe he stayed behind on solid ground while his charioteers charged into the trap. To settle these back-and-forth claims, teams of scientists and underwater archaeologists have plunged into the search. They scan the seabed with sonar, dredge for metal fragments, and sift through layers of sand. At the same time, classic texts, like the Bible, plus a handful of Egyptian records, offer surprisingly precise hints about where to look. According to those accounts, the crossing happened in a vast stretch of water at least 2,000 feet deep. That rules out small lakes or shallow rivers. The Exodus, myth or miracle? Back in the 1st century, Roman Jewish historian Josephus Flavius weighed in that maybe the Red Sea split by God's hand, or maybe by nature, and left it up to each person's choice. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Sigmund Freud dismissed the tale as a pious myth, arguing that Moses was really an Egyptian prince who cooked up Judaism for political gain. These days, explanations run the gamut from dense academic papers full of equations to popular takes like those by materials scientist Colin Humphreys. Whether you pore over lab reports or just want to avoid your little cousin's off-key 4 questions performance, there's no shortage of theories. Still, no matter how many diagrams you see or how loudly people debate, nearly everyone agrees on one thing. The parting of the sea is the most epic moment in the whole saga.
Behold his mighty hand!
The Bible captures it in simple, almost poetic terms. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand, and on their left. That image of water walls towering on either side, like nature itself bowing to let a nation pass, is the stuff of legends. But could it really happen? To find out, Florida State oceanographer Doron Knopf turned to a well-known phenomenon called the wind set-down effect. He calculated that a northwesterly wind blowing at about 20 meters per second, roughly 45 miles per hour, for 10 to 14 hours, could drop the water level by around 2 meters. That might expose an underwater ridge, giving people a brief window to cross on what looks like dry land. Still, Knopf admitted that pulling off such a storm in the right place and season is a cosmic longshot, maybe a 1 in 2,400 year event. It's possible, yes, but rare. That means if you lived back then, you'd probably never witness those exact conditions again in your lifetime. Yet for one precious night, wind and water might just have danced to the same tune, parting and returning in perfect sync with the Israelites' flight. But even if the physics check out, most scholars argue that Red Sea is a bit of a mistranslation. The Hebrew phrase Yam Suf likely means Sea of Reeds, pointing to marshy lagoons rather than the deep Red Sea we picture. So where was this reed-filled crossing? Opinions vary. In the History Channel's Exodus Decoded, Simcha Jacobovici, nicknamed the Naked Archaeologist, puts the scene in the Bitter Lakes region, a marshy stretch north of the Gulf of Suez that later vanished under the Suez Canal construction. He points to old maps showing reed beds and shallow waters ripe for a wind-set-down miracle. Walking the Bible author Bruce Feiler picks Lake Timsah as the Sea of Reeds. Sitting midway between Port Said and Suez, Timsah is shallow, dotted with mudflats, and could match ancient descriptions better than the open sea. Its mix of land and water back then makes it a strong contender. Then there's Humphreys, who sticks with the Red Sea, sort of. He argues that Red Sea might be a broad term for several connected waterways, and that the head of the Gulf of Aqaba fits the bill. The Gulf of Aqaba sits like a quiet giant at Nuweiba, touching Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. It feels almost too perfect to be a coincidence that this stretch of water lines up with the key spots in Exodus. First, remember how the Gulf of Aqaba sweeps down into what we modern folks call the Red Sea. On the far side, and almost within sight, is Mount Sinai, the very mountain where the Israelites camped, ate manna, and received the 10 Commandments after they escaped Egypt. Having the crossing so close to Sinai makes you wonder, could this have been the real place where those walls of water climbed sky high? But there's more. Just a short trek from Nuweiba's shoreline, you'll find a narrow gorge known as Pi Hahiroth, the opening of the mouth in Hebrew. Imagine 2 giant granite walls squeezing you into a single straight path. That's exactly how the Bible describes it. A tight pass that only lets you go forward, with Pharaoh's army looming behind and the vast sea ahead. No wonder the Israelites felt trapped until Moses raised his staff, where the sea stood still. Imagine standing at the edge of the Gulf of Aqaba, looking out over water that reaches nearly 3 times the height of the Empire State Building, almost 4,300 feet deep at its lowest point. If walls of water really did rise up on either side, they'd dwarf any skyscraper we've built. Those towering columns, thousands of feet high, would feel like the world itself bending to let a people walk through. No modern engineer could dream of holding water back like that. Now, picture the Israelites down below, staring up. They'd been used to the hot sun of Egypt, where every day was a grind, mixing mortar, hauling bricks. They might have felt small and unsteady in their sandals, gazing up at walls of water so high they'd have to crane their necks just to see the top. Add in the roar of wind whipping across the seabed for hours, and it must have felt like nature itself was both friend and foe, pushing them forward while threatening to sweep them away. The Gulf of Aqaba isn't some random spot on a map. It sits at a key crossroads of ancient trade routes, where incense and spices floated on wooden ships, and goods moved between Africa and Arabia. For thousands of years, people have known this waterway as a barrier and a gateway. Its location between Sinai and Arabia made it a natural defense zone, which only adds to the drama of the biblical scene, escaping from one empire's grip and heading toward a land held by another. Behind the fleeing Israelite camp thundered the Egyptian chariots. Think of them as the war machines of their day. Carved from light wood, fitted with iron fittings, and drawn by spirited horses, those chariots could bolt at speeds reaching 25 miles per hour. That's faster than a modern marathon runner. Imagine families with small children picking their way across a shallow, drying seabed, knowing an army in high-tech wheels was closing in. Panic and adrenaline would have raced through every heart. And don't forget the wind. Biblical accounts talk about a powerful east wind that blew all night, pushing back the waters and drying out the seabed. In real-world terms, sustained winds of hurricane strength could lower water levels significantly in shallow areas. But over a channel nearly a mile deep? That's hard to picture. If such winds did blow all night, the noise alone, like jet engines roaring overhead, would have added a layer of terror to the Israelites' flight. Think about what these people left behind. The steady rhythm of life in Egypt, with its steady bread rations and familiar streets. In one night, they walked from that routine into total uncertainty. Moses led them forward, but no one knew how long the trek would last, where the next meal would come from, or whether the winds and the walls of water would hold. Fear must have gnawed at them, and doubt must have whispered, maybe Egypt was better. On top of that, the Egyptian army never slowed. Chariots pounding over sand can cover ground fast. Even after 10 days of walking, the Israelites, tired, thirsty, and running low on hope, probably felt the shock of hoofbeats growing louder behind them. Their legs ached, their throats burned, and yet there was no place to hide. That sense of being trapped, caught between two watery walls and an advancing army, would push anyone to the brink. So, how did scientists shift from story to search? First, they realized that knowing the depth alone isn't enough. There might be other spots just as deep. What really matters is matching the landscape to ancient descriptions: shallow mudflats at one edge, deep water beyond, and winds that could whip through the gap. Advances in sonar mapping and submersibles now let researchers see the underwater valleys and reefs without diving themselves. These tools draw digital maps of the seabed, revealing patterns that look a lot like what one might expect if water once poured back in. Then come the artifacts. In some parts of the Gulf of Aqaba, scholars have found metal wheels that might be from chariots and bone fragments that could belong to humans or horses. Every rusty circle and fragment tells a tiny piece of the puzzle, where the army might have fallen, which routes the people took, and how deep the water was when they crossed. Together with ancient texts, these clues help narrow the search to a handful of promising spots. At the end of the day, combining old stories with new tech makes the chase as thrilling as any historical thriller. It's not just about proving a miracle happened, it's about understanding a moment that reshaped a people. The Gulf of Aqaba still holds its secrets under waves that hide coral reefs older than the tales themselves. But each sweep of a sonar beam and each brush through sediment gets us closer to seeing whether faith and nature aligned on that long-ago night. But what if the answer doesn't lie beneath the deep waters of the Gulf at all, but somewhere far more ordinary, quiet, flat, and easily overlooked? Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. At the edge of time, the sun's first light revealed a hidden cavern along the Sinai coast. Dr. Lena Saif pried open its ancient mouth, revealing walls etched with vibrant carvings, chariots, waves, and a host of figures frozen in motion. Each stroke seemed to whisper of a legend older than memory, of countless souls daring to defy the sea itself. Down in the dripping depths, her team uncovered a series of submerged coral-encrusted pillars stretching into the blue, perfectly aligned like a forgotten bridge. Back on the surface, the press gathered at the shoreline, breath held in anticipation. When Dr. Saif stepped forward, archaeologist Miguel Ortiz unfurled the tattered parchment they'd just found. With a trembling voice, he pronounced the words that would reverberate through history. Scientists finally found evidence for the Red Sea crossing. Cameras flashed, and waves lapped like eager witnesses. A hush descended as the world held its breath, wondering what truths lay hidden beneath millennia of salt and sand. Yet as night fell, a low tide revealed something else. Strange footprints vanishing into the surf. Had they stumbled on the threshold between myth and reality? Or was there a darker secret buried beneath those ancient stones? Exodus in the Delta. Imagine this. Instead of broad seas and towering walls of water, small lakes and mudflats in the Nile Delta might hold the real key to the Exodus story. That's the bold claim from scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and the University of Colorado at Boulder. Using powerful computer models, they've recreated the wind and wave conditions that could have turned a quiet lagoon into a miraculous land bridge. First, they looked at ancient geography. Long before Port Said was a bustling port city, northern Egypt was dotted with shallow lakes and marshes fed by the Nile. Drawing on earlier research, Carl Drews and his team mapped out where these waterways would have been around 3,000 years ago. Then they let their computers run wild, simulating how wind and water interact over hours, and even days. Their top finding? Forget the Red Sea. It runs north to south, so an east wind would push water north or south, hardly the neat east to west sweep described in Exodus. Instead, Drew's models pointed to a coastal lagoon near where Port Said sits today. Here's how it works. Imagine a steady east wind roaring at 63 miles per hour all night. Over these shallow flats, such gusts could pile water up on the western side of the lake, clearing a broad swath of mudflats on the eastern shore. According to the simulations, this wind-driven set-down could expose a dry path several miles long, and it wouldn't be a quick, violent event like a tsunami. Instead, the water would slide back slowly enough for people to notice, just like the Bible says. After roughly 4 hours, the wind would die down, and the lagoon's waters would rush back in, sweeping away anything left behind. That fits beautifully with Exodus. The story tells of a powerful east wind that blew all night, parting the waters and drying the seabed. By morning, Moses leads the people across. As dawn breaks, the wind stops and the waters crash back, swallowing Pharaoh's army. Drew's simulations capture that gentle but unstoppable pull of water, guided entirely by physics. This isn't the first attempt to explain the crossing with natural forces. Some have floated the tsunami idea, a massive wave smashing in, then sucking back out. But tsunamis come fast and furious, not slow and steady, and they leave wreckage in their wake. Others pointed to reefs near the Suez Canal that might emerge under hurricane-strength winds. But those northerly storms would blast people off their feet, and Exodus specifically mentions an east wind. Drew's work stands out because it matches the details, the wind's direction, the timing, and the shape of the waterway. By running simulation after simulation, tweaking wind speeds and water depths, he zeroed in on a scenario that ticks all the boxes. Crucially, the lake's shallow depth, just a few feet in places, makes it possible for wind alone to shift water levels dramatically. That's something you just can't do in the deep Red Sea. Beyond satisfying a long-standing mystery, these findings shine a light on how ancient people interacted with their environment. They didn't need to understand fluid dynamics to experience its effects. They just knew that sometimes the wind can be mightier than the sea. For the Israelites, that meant a chance at freedom. For modern researchers, it's a chance to blend history, archaeology, and climate science into one compelling story. Of course, not everyone is convinced. Some archaeologists argue there's still no smoking gun artifact, no cluster of chariot wheels or human bones in that coastal lagoon. Others point out that coastlines shift over millennia, and the exact shape of those ancient lakes is hard to pin down. But by combining computer power with on-the-ground digs, Drews and his colleagues are building a case stronger than mud alone. Volcano or miracle? England's BBC recently aired a special claiming that the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea weren't miracles at all. but the fallout of a volcanic blast on Santorini around the 16th century BC.
The island of Santorini was a vast volcano called Thera.
It's a clever story. A cloud of ash drifts over Egypt, pitches the skies into darkness, tosses down hail and lightning, turns the Nile blood red, and even stirs up a tidal wave that briefly splits the sea. But dig a little deeper, and you'll see why this volcanic theory doesn't quite hold water. First off, let's talk about timing. The Santorini eruption is usually dated around 1628 BC, give or take a few decades, but most scholars place the exodus much later, somewhere around 1446 BC, if you follow the early date, or even in the 13th century BC, if you go by the later date. That's a gap of almost 2 centuries, which is a long time to pin a single event on one volcano. If the eruption really caused the plagues, why don't we see evidence of marauding frogs or red rivers in texts written closer to 1600 BC? The timeline simply doesn't line up. Then there's the ash cloud itself. Volcanic dust can indeed darken skies, but for it to drift all the way to Egypt in a heavy, concentrated form, it's a stretch. Winds at high altitudes don't behave like a simple breeze. They swirl and change direction, scattering ash widely. If Egypt had been blanketed in thick ash, we'd expect to find deep layers of volcanic glass in the soil around the Nile Delta, and we don't. Instead, archeological digs turn up mud and silt with barely a trace of Santorini's signature crystal shards. Next, consider the chain of biological events the theory proposes. Yes, polluted water can kill fish and drive frogs ashore, but to claim those same toxins then attracted clouds of flies, lice, and disease-carrying insects requires a perfect storm of conditions. Frogs would need to die by the millions at just the right shoreline spots, and flies would have to emerge and swarm immediately after. In real ecosystems, these processes take time, days, even weeks, not a neat overnight sequence that matches Exodus's timeline. What about the tidal wave that supposedly parted the Red Sea?
The Red Sea is not a crimson curse, but a chilling tale of Trichodesmium erythraeum.
Natural tsunamis smash in quickly, with towering walls of water that crash onto the land. They don't settle into calm, walkable corridors with 2 still walls flanking travelers. Imagine being in that mega tsunami. You wouldn't see a clear path. You'd be battered by waves up to 30 feet high, with debris and currents ripping through. A tsunami leaves wreckage, not neat tracks across dry ground. There's also a glaring lack of Egyptian records. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous chroniclers. They carved battle scenes, recorded harvests, and logged temple offerings on stone walls. But nowhere do we find an account of a lone volcano causing 10 nasty plagues or triggering a mass exodus of slaves. If a tidal wave had really crashed through their borders, you'd expect to see it on a temple wall, or at least in a papyrus scroll. Silence on such a dramatic event speaks volumes. In fact, this Santorini Exodus link echoes an idea first floated 2 decades ago by Johns Hopkins Egyptologist Hans Godeke. Both he and the BBC special are attempts to strip away the supernatural and reduce Exodus to geology and biology. They're part of a bigger trend. Let's call it the Old Testament demythologizing. The goal is to explain every miracle as a quirk of nature. That's a fine exercise, but it often forces the facts to fit the theory, instead of letting the theory follow the facts. So while the volcanic story is exciting, who doesn't love a good disaster plot? The more you look, the more cracks you see. Ask if the dates match, if the ash evidence shows up on the ground, or if tsunamis ever act like patient doormen. The simple truth is that no single natural event ticks all the boxes of the Exodus account. The volcanic theory is a fun idea to toss around, but it falls short of explaining why a people would suddenly leave in such panic, why no Egyptian records exist, or how a tsunami could create a safe path through the waves.